It is said the new bombing of North Vietnam is only temporary, and the policy still is gradually to end the war. Nobody says when, and nobody gives any persuasive reasons why it didn't end long ago.
I know everybody wants to end the war. I don't need to hear that, you know. And we are ending it. Christ, I know what they think. I don't need to be told.
It is hard to remember the time when the American people tended to believe what their government said.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end. No safety or surprise, the end. I'll never look into your eyes again. Can you picture what will be so limitless and free? Desperately in need of some stranger's hand in a desperate land.
And they realise that there is all sorts in these tapes that are gonna implicate them. Well, when Haldeman reports it back to Nixon, Nixon's just silent for long periods. It's not really saying much that you can hear.
You can just imagine like that feeling of when you realise you've fucked up. That kind of hot sort of fear, I guess, or that sort of
that prickly sweat breaking out all over.
that kind of like shame and like I don't know. Yeah, but can you imagine doing it on, on that kind of scale? Like, if you fuck up at work or something and you haven't realised, or just in the moment you realise that you're going to have to face the music at some point, you're going to have to tell your boss that you didn't do this thing or you did a thing and it was wrong, and like that's quite uncomfortable, isn't it? But can you imagine being that public, at that level, that kind of like, oh shit, I'm going to end my career in disgrace potentially.
Yeah, it's like it's
most
almost
public, like a criminal thing, like something that is actually going to end up in a court of law.
Like you'd be ashamed if your mum found out that you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost afraid of ever having a large amount of power or authority. Not that I ever probably will, but I'm afraid of that just because it might end as badly as Nixon. It's such a terrifying prospect.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's around this time as well that Ehrlichman finally admits to Nixon, just explicitly, that he was highly involved in the Ellsberg break-in. And again, it's one of those times you'd expect Nixon to go a bit mad, or at least like a quiet rage, tell him he must immediately leave and doesn't want to ever see his face again. But he doesn't. Nixon just takes it in his stride. He even just immediately starts spinning the story and spinning their potential testimony as to how to make that work in their advantage or downplay it. Again, not really the behaviour of someone who is just clean remotely. And from this point on, they're constantly shitting themselves about what John Dean is going to say. From this point, he went from his golden boy that would be able to help him to his worst enemy that knows all the dirty secrets.
John Dean was the most devastating witness I ever heard, and I've As a lawyer and a judge and a legislator, I've spent many years of my life listening to witnesses.
And they go over and over the March 21st tapes. I mean, Nixon knows that's a bad one. Towards the very end of April, a story breaks in the New York Times about when Patrick Gray got that envelope full of information about Howard Hunt. It was probably leaked by Mark Felt, the Deep Throat. And what Gray did with that envelope full of information about Howard Hunt, and what he should have done is given it to the people investigating within the FBI, but he just destroyed it.
Brilliant.
Crazily, he just destroyed it, and that comes out, and so there's no way he can really be confirmed. You know, his career's kind of over at that point, along with a lot of other people around Nixon.
Yeah.
But he claims it was Ehrlichman who told him to destroy them. But yeah, I mean, people are just tumbling all around Nixon.
Yeah, definitely. It's a house of cards, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, you get more and more isolated, I guess, maybe.
Mm.
In the news, they start linking the Ellsberg break-in with the with the Ellsberg break-in to his the offices of his psychiatrist and the Watergate break-in.
Yeah.
And this is on April 27th. It sort of explodes, and from this point on, the media. Well, before, like I said, around the election time, the Washington Post was hard on the story, but everyone else wasn't, and it was kind of a fine line whether the press were going to sort of really push it and keep it on the front or not. But after this, there's no doubt. Yeah, this is just a great story as it all starts unfolding.
That's the thing, because it's all very well. You get people like the best advisors, or the chief of staff even, but it's really, really high level people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, they're the top of the government.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's right at the end of April, and well, the very end of April and the beginning of May, when Nixon just insists that Ehrlichman and Haldeman have to go. And he does. Apparently, when he tells Ehrlichman he has to resign at Camp David, they're both crying. Apparently, Nixon is crying.
Oh, man.
But, yeah, which is weird because Ehrlichman's, basically a piece of shit. And, well, they both are, of course, but Nixon would know it, that he's done him a disservice, really. But there you go. And Nixon makes up a scene in his memoirs, which the records show did not happen or could not have happened.
God. Right.
Where he says there was like at the sunset at Camp David, he was with Ron Ziegler, his press secretary. And there's he talks about they looked at the sunset together, and had to make the fateful decision that they'd have to be fired, and it's just not true. That's just some artistic license there.
Yeah.
There's no need. Again, you would think Nixon would realise that people would be able to just look up exactly who was where on what dates.
Yeah.
And that couldn't be right.
Yeah.
But yeah, apparently not. I mean, that's something that runs through what Nixon does, is that he doesn't actually go back and check the record himself personally.
It's just bullshit.
Until it's so late. Yeah. Yeah, it was just put layer upon layer of bullshit and not actually go back to the original thing until it's way, way, way too late. So anyway, Ehrlichman and Haldeman are gone, but they're still around. But Nixon does his broadcast, and he still claims that he knew nothing until March 21st, and that's his official line that he has to stick to. This on the April 30th. That's the day he says there can be no whitewash at the White House. That's the one.
We must maintain the integrity of the White House. And that integrity must be real, not transparent. There can be no whitewash at the White House.
Right, so Nixon, despite everything, in his memoir, does actually admit to a lot of it in the end. It's funny that the Nixon interviews with David Frost are thought of as, in any way, Nixon coming clean and admitting what he'd done. And if you actually watch the original videos, the original interviews, he doesn't, I don't think, really give up anything. When it comes down to the crucial moment, am I sorry? He says, no, I'll never grovel. But in his memoir, he does actually say it more or less explicitly. He says this, quote, I gave the impression that I had known nothing at all of the cover-up until my March 21st meeting with Dean. I indicated that once I had learned about it, I had acted with dispatch and dispassion to end it. In fact, I had known some of the details of the cover-up before March 21st. And when I did become aware of their implications, instead of exerting presidential leadership aimed at uncovering the cover-up, I embarked upon an increasingly desperate search for ways to limit the damage to my friends, to my administration, and to myself. I mean, quote, end of quote. That pretty much says it all.
Well, yeah,
I
he
don't
just
know why he
submitted.
couldn't say it to David Frost. I guess he's just not the type of guy that, under the scrutiny and the lights, would ever allow himself to do it, I guess.
Yeah, but no, he just completely. Yeah, he
Yeah.
actually did own up to it.
You mean
And
that
for all
you're
those things, I have a very deep regret.
you got caught up in something and then it snowballed?
It snowballed. And it was my fault. I'm not blaming anybody else. Yeah. When I resigned, people didn't think it was enough to admit mistakes, fine. If they want me to get down and grovel on the floor, no, never. Because I don't believe I should.
But this is years later he wrote that.
Sure.
He still has to go through all the terrible things that
Yeah.
come up. I mean, on May the 3rd, Ron Ziegler, his press secretary, has to come out. On May the 3rd, Ron Ziegler is basically acting like a chief of staff because Haldeman's gone and they haven't got a replacement for him. They do eventually get Al Haig, who's a general and was Kissinger's sort of second in command, a guy directly under Kissinger, who was really instrumental in all the China stuff and the Vietnam negotiations. So he's a real hardball player. And Nixon gets General Al Haig in to be his chief of staff, which is funny. So he goes from Kissinger's whipping boy to at least nominally Kissinger's boss. Kissinger's got a huge ego, so apparently he didn't like that one bit. But there you go.
Gutted.
Poor
Yeah.
old,
Poor Kissinger. Yeah.
poor old Kissinger. So Watergate now just starts playing out in the media big time, but still 77% of people thought Nixon was probably innocent. People still thought that a president, they had no inkling that he was just an out and out liar, criminal type. Why would you? You'd sort of give leaders the benefit of a doubt, especially then in those days, right? Not quite as jaded as we are now.
Yeah, I mean, largely because of this scandal, I guess. Or
Nixon had also had to fire the Attorney General Kleindienst, and he replaced him with a guy called Richardson, who actually becomes an important name or kind of important figure in this, because the Attorney General is basically in charge of the body of government that's prosecuting these guys.
right,
So
of course, yeah.
it's a weird thing that the president gets to appoint the Attorney General, who then, well, you get it, is in charge of the people. So they hope that they can get an Attorney General who's going to be sort of sympathetic to them. But then sort of missing the point, because the Attorney General's got to be, unbiased as much as possible anyway. I mean, Kleindienst wasn't really. So they hope this Richardson guy will sort of do their bidding to some extent. But it's not really the way it plans out. Nixon lies specifically to Al Haig about his March 21st meeting as well, saying, I never said we'll just pay them $1 million. It's around early May that Haldeman and Ehrlichman actually go before the grand jury. Haldeman says it was a bit of a traumatic experience, no holds barred sort of thing, and you haven't got anyone sort of helping you or stepping in if they're badgering you or anything like that, apparently. On the night of May the 9th, there's a phone call between Nixon and Haig where they discuss whether they should just go the route of letting it, quote, all hang out, i.e. just completely telling the truth. And they decide not to. They decide against that. And there's a quote where Nixon says, all right, we'll cover up until hell freezes over. So that's that. I mean, it doesn't matter what's in the 18 and a half minutes of missing tape. That's it.
Yeah.
But in May the 10th, Haldeman's still in the Oval Office talking about the March 21st meetings, trying to reshape it. Nixon's trying to sort of coach him on how he's going to, not perjure himself. And this is on May the 10th. That's when they decide they would add in the statement that it would be wrong after his $1 million payout thing.
And that's the
That's
bit.
when they
That's when he
concoct
perches
that.
himself. Yeah. Oh man.
Oh, that's when they concoct that he's going to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And then
Yeah,
he actually says it.
yeah,
Oh, it's
yeah.
so dumb.
The
It's so lame. Like all their
yeah,
like this whole thing is so lame. Like it's so sort of small time, really.
amateur hour.
Like yeah, it's just needless, just like petty, dumb behaviour.
Well, you expect people at the top of the federal government to be really sophisticated, really articulate players,
Yeah,
and
or
they're just not.
at
Or not then.
least decisive or have some strategy rather than just bungling, just bumbling the way through everything. But yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense. It's just human nature, isn't it? They just want it to go away. They just want to forget about it, or just hoping that it will sort itself out.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so.
Mentioned it earlier, just how many people where it's their job to protect the president or the office of the president or
Mm.
the federal government or the state or whatever. It's like that's partly their job, you know, and like it's a bit of a grey area when you might have to be asked to go further than that, and in the moment you might not be considering about the legality of a situation, and then sometimes you might find yourself in a situation where you're acting but you've never really stopped to consider all the implications or where it might lead, or you know, with hindsight as you go through it you're able to pick apart what's happened and where you've gone wrong. But when you're in the middle of something, you might not be thinking, "Oh, I should. This is the point where I should say no," or "This is the point where I should like pack my bags and leave the country." Or
my participation in the Watergate operation, on my part, for whatever reasons I may have had at the time, whatever rationale I may have had at the time, was an error, was a mistake, and a very grave mistake, which I regret.
He thought that he was a patriot, that he thought he was doing things for his country. Perhaps he had to know better. But he did have a higher perception of his goals, and that he did at least think that he was doing something for his president, and doing something for the White House, even though it was something he should have known better about doing. And that when he realized that the White House and the president were not going to back him up, and they were not going to stand behind him and admit that, yes, we authorized this, and this was a White House operation, and that he was going to go down in history as simply a burglar, a common criminal. James McCord couldn't stomach that.
but yeah, it just seems like when you're running through it, all the stuff they're saying is just so dumb, pointless. Like you said, that things can be checked. You know, like things can be double checked. If you're going to lie about it, you should think it through. Really.
Yeah, you would think, right? You would think that. Yeah, well, it's like a comedy of errors. There's so many different angles at which it could have been addressed instead of the way he does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it must be that he was just used to getting away with it. I heard Bill Burr talk about Arnie when Arnie got caught sleeping with his maid. That why wouldn't Arnie think that he could sleep with his maid in his own house and get away with it? He's been doing that sort of shit his entire life. Why would he's got away with so much more than that? And I think this is sort of that effect that Nixon, his whole life, has just been a sort of dirty dealing, backroom kind of guy.
Crook.
A crook, yeah, basically
Yeah.
the whole time. And why wouldn't he be able to get away with this? On May the 11th, the Ellsberg case sort of collapses because and the judge of that case publicly really criticizes the Nixon White House, saying it's a bit of a disgrace that he had people breaking in
Wow. Yeah.
and over the next few days, there's more revelations in the press that there was wiretappings of journalists going back to 1968 and 69. By May 14th, panic basically seems to have set in the inner circle, Nixon's inner circle. Richardson, the new Attorney General, is on the lookout for a special prosecutor to do exactly that, to prosecute this case, all the new things that are coming out about it. And they hope that Richardson won't find a really, really aggressive special prosecutor. But again, that's not the case. It's around this time that in the evidence that various people are giving that it starts to get to Nixon himself, that he becomes accused of things that he must have at some point, somewhere or other, have ordered his top guys to do this sort of thing. So it's only at this point throughout. I mean, we know, as I've gone through the story, we know everything that's happened as it's happened. But remember, the public don't really know hardly any of this yet. They don't even know yet that there are any tapes. Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, has to go before the press at this point and admit that the Dean report that Nixon had claimed told him everything about it never even existed. That was always a fiction. Nixon had made it up.
Wow.
And Ziegler has to admit that was the case at this point. By the 17th of May, the Senate hearings start, and that's that's where you've got the footage that you can go on YouTube now and watch these guys, Dean, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, Mitchell, talking to the Senate, and that's what people started to get. The American public and all around the world, people start tuning into that. Like the OJ case, it became like a serial
televised,
in its own right.
Yeah.
And apparently, everyone that lived through it, it's a bit before our time, say it really was gripping.
Now, on the 27th of January, 1972, Gordon Liddy presented a plan in your office, in the office of the Attorney General of the United States. And that plan, complete with visual aids, included elaborate charts of electronic surveillance and breaking and entering and prostitution and kidnapping and mugging. Now, you've indicated that in hindsight, you probably should have thrown him out of the office.
Out of the window, I think.
Maybe even out of the window, in hindsight. The life of every American, or to a great degree, his liberty, protection of all of his rights sits in the hand of the Attorney General of the United States. And do you mean to tell me that you sat there through that meeting and, in fact, actually had the same man come back into your office for a second meeting without in any way alerting appropriate authorities, in this particular case, the President of the United States?
That is exactly what happened, Senator. And as I say, in hindsight, it was a grievous error.
But only later, at first, it seemed like it was a bit of a damp squib. They called the least important people first. And there was even some hope in the Nixon White House that it would, that people didn't really care about it and it wouldn't necessarily blow up into a giant thing. And they were hoping that it would, just become a Washington story rather than a national story. And Nixon bangs on again about that thing that, people will think that that's just part of the course. Everyone's bugging everyone and they caught some guys this time and that's it. It's not, certainly would never threaten the presidency. That's what he hopes. But it's pretty clear that that's kind of rosy thinking, to say the least. A guy called, a professor called Archibald Cox is appointed to be the special prosecutor. And this guy, he's a venerable professor of constitutional law. He's got no love for Nixon. I don't think he was ever on record as being a Nixon hater, but he's definitely for the law first. So he will uncover. It becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that he will uncover anything he has to. He's not prepared to cut any corners to try and save the blushes of Richard Nixon. And of course, that's a headache.
That's the last thing you want. Jesus.
Yeah. On May 21st, the White House released a white paper. Now, this is Nixon's legal defense. This is his formal statement from the office of the president of what he knew and when, the Nixon defense. And it says, among other things, that he didn't know anything about it until March 21st, a complete lie. And so it was actually May 22nd that was released. It also specifically says that he never asked the CIA to back the FBI off. So he's just compounding lies at this point. I've never actually been there, maybe on like really minor things, comical things. But if you ever realise you're compounding a lie with a lie, it's like I say, I've never done it on anything big. If I had, I wouldn't be able to sleep and stuff. Let alone you're a president and you're making legal statements. I can't imagine it.
It's like we said earlier, though, by the time you're in that position, you must have got over that so many times. You must have to bullshit so much to get to where you are. The way that they have to pretend to be more religious than they are, and the stuff you have to toe the party line. You have to stay on message, and even if it's totally not what you believe personally, you have to say it to the public in front of television cameras or microphones or whatever, as if you believe it. After years of doing that, then I think you've got into the habit, or you've trained yourself, or you've lost any, I don't know, that part of yourself that gets concerned about lying. Maybe, I don't know. You just sort of, politicians obviously rightly get cussed out for being just lying scumbags, but that's the whole nature of the political system. Lying is at the very core of it. That's just how it works, you know.
Yeah, and also, but it's even more than that, isn't it? Or more complicated than that. It's lying by omission. It's telling
Yeah.
half truths. It's skating that line of perjury.
Right.
It's
Right.
exaggerating certain truths. It's the whole sort of smorgasbord of lies.
Yeah.
And yeah, compounding them on top of each other. Well, God, I wouldn't be able to sleep, I don't think.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's so tiring, isn't it? Creatively lying and then trying to keep it in place, keep all those lies in place.
So after this white paper is released, it's basically Nixon's word versus anyone who cares to challenge it, basically. And the only people that really do it, well, the only one who does really is John Dean. A lot of the people, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, are prepared to perjure themselves
Mm.
and do,
Mm.
but it's Dean who sort of comes out and spills his guts completely truthfully,
Wow.
it seems. Amazingly, it's not until the 5th of June that Nixon himself listens to some of the tapes. He spends a lot of that day listening to loads of the tapes, and he thinks they exonerate him. I think he thinks that his defense, that this is a national security question, he kind of really believes that on some level, or needs to believe it so much that, yeah, he goes back on this day and he says, "Oh, I think these tapes are actually going to be good for us."
Wow.
He still doesn't want to release them. It's the last thing he really wants to do. But yeah, Archibald Cox starts playing hardball, starts calling up the most important people and asking the hardest questions. And Richardson, the Attorney General, allows Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, to look into, he has to get permission to, and he's allowed to look into all sorts of different areas. Nixon has a bit of a what the fuck moment. Apparently, he literally said something like that when he read the headline. He didn't actually say what the fuck, but he said something like, "Why did he do that?" or something along those lines. He just can't believe it. It's basically clear that Richardson, his Attorney General, he's not going to bat for Nixon.
Shit.
And Nixon seems taken aback a bit. He sends Al Haig, his Chief of Staff, down there to sort of have a shouting match with him. But after that, John Dean gets immunity, which means, he's free to speak, putting himself in jail for many a year. Nixon claims that he's suddenly found more notes that he made from the March 21st meeting that exonerate himself, obviously. But in fact, he'd only made them 8 days previous,
Oh God.
when he'd listened to the tapes for the first time.
Oh man.
Yeah, it's funny. It's not funny, haha, but it's funny how desperate this sort of situation becomes. He speaks to, in the middle of June, speaks to Coulson for the first time in quite a while.
Yeah.
And Coulson's just a complete sycophant, really, just patting his hand and giving him the sympathy he looks for. Nixon looks for sympathy from people a lot. I don't know. It's weird that that's a sort of sign of insecurity, and
Sure.
I suppose you're supposed to be a rock of a character, of a person, if you're the president, right? If you're the top,
Yeah.
the buck stops with you. It's weird that you would call up 5 people one after another, searching for sympathy for your position, but that's the sort of thing he does. On June 18th, the Watergate hearings, this is the Senate ones that are televised, they're halted because Brezhnev, the Russian leader, comes to visit. It's a scheduled visit, and as you can imagine, it's a bit of a weird thing. Brezhnev knows, along with everyone else, that Nixon's in the middle of this firestorm, and it's as I say, it's still far from clear that it's going to take him down. It doesn't look good, but people still don't know about the tapes or anything. Yeah, Brezhnev has his visit, but after that, Archibald Cox keeps pushing harder, and John Dean actually has given his evidence. But Nixon doesn't watch the hearings.
I told the president about the fact that there was no money to pay these individuals to meet their demands. He asked me how much it would cost. I told him I could only make an estimate that it might be as high as $1 million or more. He told me that that was no problem. He also looked over at Haldeman and repeated the same statement.
Dean said he was exasperated by the president's unwillingness to see how serious the situation was.
It was my particular concern with the fact that the president did not seem to understand the implications of what was going on. For example, when I had earlier told him that I thought I was involved in an obstruction of justice situation, he had argued with me to the contrary after I'd explained it to him. Also, when the matter of money demands had come up, previously he had very nonchalantly told me that that was no problem. I did not know if he realized that he himself could be getting involved in an obstruction of justice.
According to most accounts, he doesn't watch the televised hearings, which is weird because everything hinges on them, or a lot of stuff hinges on it. And he doesn't actually personally watch it, which is weird. Apparently he's not a TV watcher. Like I said earlier, he grew up in, his formative years would have been the 20s or the 30s. He's one of those old guys that wasn't really into TV.
Still weird, like you might not be into some other media, but if it was crucial to your continued sort of position, or you would watch it. But yeah, uncomfortable to watch, I'm sure. Like, I don't like watching people have to go through that, even when I don't know who they are and it's got nothing to do with me. Because most people squirm so much, even professional politicians and people that probably haven't done a massive amount wrong. But if you're sitting in front of one of those, all those people sitting there up on their thrones staring down at you and scrutinizing you, and then there's 5 cameras pointed at you and microphones and a whole rows and rows of people sitting behind you, everyone hanging on your every word, and everyone analyzing your behavior. Why did you do this thing that you did like 3 years ago? Why did you said this? So, but then you did this. Like, what have you got to say about that sort of thing? That is like, oh God, that's so horrible, isn't it? Like, that kind of scrutiny is just.
Yeah, I think with the Nuremberg trials, there was one guy, I can't remember. I think he's one of the propagandists that when he got on the stand was just completely unrepentant.
Yeah.
When they just showed him evidence of when he'd incited genocide or whatever, he was just like, yes, and I'd do it again. I was merely speaking the truth.
Yeah.
That mentality.
Yeah.
Is
like Blair. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
But it's like a millimetre away from insanity, and I don't know. It's crazy.
Yeah, self-belief to that
Brass
extent
balls.
is not normal. So yeah. I mean, I guess I can understand Nixon not wanting to tune in and watch his best buddies like get ripped apart. So.
Well, I mean, it does eventually take a bit of a toll on Nixon. He gets ill at this point. On July the 12th, he's taken into hospital with chest pains. He's got pneumonia, actually.
Right.
And they tell him to stay in hospital for 4 or 5 days, but he doesn't. I think he only stays there for... Oh, no, he does stay for a few days, but he's just still trying to work from his hospital bed, trying to disrupt Archibald Cox and the Senate committee any way he can. On that day, one of what people think is a relatively minor guy, Alexander Butterfield, is interviewed. And it's, Nixon stays in hospital till the 20th, actually, of July. But on the 16th, this guy, Butterfield, is asked before the Senate hearings. I'm not sure if it's the actual lead senator, Sam Irving, but someone's asked him, are you aware if the president tapes everything that happens? Now, Butterfield knew that he was one of the very few people who knew that Nixon did do that. And he'd already been before the grand jury, but the grand jury, as I said, are like normal jurors. They're just normal people selected almost at random. And they're not sort of savvy Washington political players. So they didn't even know to ask the question. But these senators, Democratic senators, are much more in the know. And Butterfield, being an operator, knew that you don't offer up information. But if you're directly asked a question,
you have to answer it.
Yeah. So on this day, the 16th, I believe it was, they ask him, do you know if the president had recordings? And when he sort of pauses for a moment and says yes, the whole world goes a bit crazy.
Nothing but the truth, so help you God.
So help me God.
John Dean, the ex-White House counsel, testified today that President Nixon knew about the Watergate cover-up.
Dean read through a 245-page statement, a president too easily upset by anti-war demonstrators, wiretapping of newsmen, a proposal to firebomb and burglarize the Brookings Institution, spying on Senator Kennedy and other Democrats, efforts to involve the CIA in the cover-up, Haldeman Ehrlichman orders to set up a payoff fund, perjury plans, a fictitious Dean investigation.
Coming right down to it, Al, when you look at it, and all this crap we're taking, wouldn't it really be better for the country, to just check out and no, seriously, I mean that, and because you see, I'm not at my best, I've got to be at my best, and that means fighting this damn battle, fighting it all out.
There was a surprise witness at the Watergate hearings today, and he made a dramatic disclosure.
You aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
Alexander Butterfield, former aide to H.R. Haldeman, said that President Nixon ordered secret electronic listening devices installed in his offices and on his telephones.
But so far as you know, all telephone calls were also recorded.
From the President's office telephone,
yes,
on his desk in the Oval Office,
yes,
and his regular office phone in the Executive Office building, and the desk telephone in his study at Camp David, and his telephone in the Lincoln sitting room. Those 4 phones.
The White House today confirmed that the President no longer secretly records conversations. Deputy News Secretary Gerald Warren said, quote, "The system has been deactivated." When asked why, he answered, quote, "The system has been compromised." The Secret Service says it guards the Nixon tapes, but the tapes are in the control and custody of the White House.
The pressure is on the President to produce those tapes, or run the grave risk that public opinion will decide he can't because of what is on them.